The Bob Murphy Show, episode 340.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to The Bob Murphy Show. Today I'm going to be speaking with Bob Burnett, who's the founder and CEO of Barefoot Mining, a company focused on the development of horse-class mining sites. And he's a vocal proponent for the expansion of diversity in Bitcoin mining site geography, scale, and energy sources. Bob has spent 40 years as a technologist, including 13 years at Gateway, a Fortune 200 personal computer company, where he led the company's product development efforts as chief technical officer. Bob also founded and manages the Barefoot Bitcoin Fund, serves on the board of directors for Ocean, a company focused on transparency and decentralization of Bitcoin mining pools, and is on the board of advisors for the Satoshi Action Fund. And Bob's also an evangelist and educator for Bitcoin and its importance to the world's future. He has 8 U.S. patents and a degree in computer engineering from the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee. What we're mostly focused on, so Bob recently spoke at the Nashville Bitcoin conference, and his talk there had to do with the concentration of power, both literal and metaphorical, in Bitcoin. And so that's really what we're talking about, his vision for the future, how he thinks things are going to unfold. And we spend a bit of time, if this is something that is of interest to you, on this issue of the Bitcoin mining pools. So as you may be aware, an individual Bitcoin miner can enter a pool of other such miners, and they kind of agree to spread the rewards when any one of them happens to hit and mines a block. And so some people have worried about the concentration of power, and is this defeating the original vision of a decentralized protocol? So we really get into that in this episode. So without further ado, here's my discussion with Bob Burnett. Hey, Bob, welcome to the Bob Murphy Show.
Great to see you, Bob. Thanks for having me.
Well, maybe we could start out with, you recently were at the Nashville Bitcoin conference, and I know you spoke there. Do you want to maybe give us the audience some clue as to what you spoke about, and then maybe what your feeling was there? I know there were a lot of big names there and a lot of energy in that event.
Yeah, my topic was the centralization of Bitcoin. What were the forces that, especially in the mining industry, which is some of my area of expertise, what are the forces that are driving us towards centralization? How do we fight against it and stay decentralized? I thought the conference itself was kind of interesting in that you could see a certain maturity of the industry. So if we go back 4 or 5 years, it was a very insular community, very tried and true, deeply convicted Bitcoiners. And I think now what we saw was really an emergence of people who had a certain understanding of Bitcoin, but they weren't, they're not driving it from the same perspective. And I think for instance, the ETF approvals last January brought a lot of interest from people who don't necessarily understand all the intricacies of Bitcoin. They're not coming at it from this with the same maybe conviction. Like I spoke actually in Prague, interestingly, in June as well. It's a big European conference. And the people there were like really deep Bitcoiners. So there were people from Slovenia, Slovakia, Ukraine, Czech Republic. And they were people all coming from, hey, the Soviet Union's on our doorstep. We know the stories of our parents and, what it was like to live in that era. And, we're here to protect our sovereignty and all that sort of stuff. And then you have this American audience, which is actually, I shouldn't say American audience because it was very global, but it was kind of has a different feel. And it's certainly all the politicians there, showed how it was becoming more of a mainstream topic. And, I saw the same thing in the personal computer industry. For those who don't know, I spent most of my career in the personal computer industry. going back to the late 70s, mid 80s. I was there kind of at the inception. And it was the same thing. In those early personal computer conferences, it was a nerd fest, right?
Mm-hmm.
And by the time we got to the mid 90s, it was more representative of the mainstream of America. And I'd say it was very similar in Nashville.
Okay, so I mean, with broad strokes, like in earlier, even US-based conferences, it was more technical people who liked Bitcoin for, the mechanics of it and the promise of the future. Whereas you're saying in this one, there was more of like people who were there just interested in it as like an asset.
Yeah, and I mean they have a curiosity certainly, and certainly the folks coming from often libertarian mindsets. There's people that are coming from the Austrian perspective, or at least some muddled version of it, right? And we used to have a lot of that, and we had the cypherpunks, and we had those kind of people. And now the complexion's changed a bit. It's a little more. I don't want to say just number go up.
Right.
Because I think that would be a misnomer, but they're worried about the dollar. They're trying to protect their future. They're not just trying to trade it. Like we're not in that stage, but we're at a stage where not everybody's as interested in what's going on at the detail level, and maybe only certain aspects of what I consider to be the core elements of Bitcoin are interesting to them. They have select interests.
Okay, well, do you want to unpack a little bit about with the speech you gave there in terms of you said decentralization?
Yeah. So in Bitcoin, I think like anything else, right? Anything that strives to be decentralized, that starts finding success, there's seems to always be forces to try to capture it. And I think that's just a basic concept. So in Bitcoin, there are a couple elements right now where centralization is occurring. One is in the development of the systems themselves. So we have Bitmain, which is the 800-pound gorilla on the hardware side, which makes most of the hardware. And so, what we need more of a world like we have in the personal computer space, where you have Intel and AMD and a couple other smaller companies that make chips. And then we have all kinds of different system vendors like Dell and Toshiba, et cetera, that are innovating and building systems, and instead of just one providing it. And that presents a risk. Another big risk is in the pool side. So for those who aren't less familiar, in Bitcoin mining, there are about 6 million servers in the world right now trying to mine a block. Okay. And every 10 minutes a block gets mined. So if you extrapolate that math, what you'll find is there's about 53,000 blocks per year mined. And typically you only get paid if you win the block. So if you do that math, obviously you have less than 0.5% chance of, or something like that. I'm not sure the math, but it's a really small percentage chance that your machine is going to mine a block. So pools were formed such that if I have 10 machines and somebody else has 10 machines, we agree to kind of go in together and say, hey, if I win, I'll get half of the money, and if you win, you'll get half of the money. But I'll pay you and you pay me, and now we're spreading our risk out. But the problem in Bitcoin has become that there's only about 15 of those pools now, and of those 15 pools, 6 of them comprise about 90% of the blocks. And of those 6 companies, 4 are Chinese based, primarily led by Bitmain, by the way. They're proxies. There's 2 large ones in America, one called Foundry, which is the biggest, and one called Luxor. So that really presents this, the risk that presents then is that all of the transaction selection, which we can get into a little more, but basically all this transaction selection about what things are going to get processed by the network goes through just 6 places, and 2 in the US and 4 in China. And it makes it very easy for that to get captured theoretically, right? I'm not saying it is now, but it's pretty easy for whether that's OFAC compliance or some sort of a blacklist or whitelist or like those sort of things to get implemented. And that doesn't necessarily break Bitcoin, but it takes away one of the core elements of Bitcoin, which is the censorship resistance. Anyway, those are a couple examples of centralization forces.
Can we? Yeah, let's, if you don't mind, let's focus on that latter part, the pooling, because that's something I know when I co-authored a thing years ago at this point on the economics of
paper.
Bitcoin. We had I had to talk to a few people, make sure I understood like the theory behind that. So I'm just gonna be basic, but again, just for the listeners. So the ideal of Bitcoin, when people were first conceiving of it, was that it's completely decentralized. Anybody who wants to can download the protocol and they can become a miner, with their local machine. And I know some guys that, back in the day, they were just, they were doing it in their living room. And now that wouldn't be profitable. You would never get anything with that limited computational power. And so, but as you say, now there's such competition. There's so much computing power in the network as a whole that any one machine, the chance of it hitting is very low. And so most likely they would be chugging along, basically trying to solve math problems for years on end before they saw any Satoshis at all. But if they did hit, it would be a big, nice chunk.
Yes.
And so it's almost like the reverse of insurance, where you join these pools to spread. It's not the risk of something bad happening. It's the risk of something good happening. And so it's like almost like a mirror image of insurance. And so, so everybody joins these pools. And so the pool collectively, if anybody in the pool solves the problem, then they have rules about, okay, this is how we're going to distribute. And obviously it's based on your computational power and whatever. Like if there's a bigger player in the pool, they get more of a payout and so on. It's kind of like, back in the day when the men would go hunting or something, if one guy got a big kill, he would share his meat with the other people because they would know, that might happen to this guy down, next month. So, okay. So that's how that worked. But then of course the issue, as you're saying, is you lose a bit of the decentralization, the fact that, no one person is in charge of Bitcoin. It's just out there and it's decentralized. And so,
Yeah, and there's a couple issues. And I should point out, even if you're not an individual miner, if you're a commercial miner, like we have a mining operation, we'd probably be considered a small to medium size mining operation. We have probably, let's just say, several thousand servers in our domain, but it's still not enough that if we what would be called solo mined, like you were referring to, solo mining, we could go days or even weeks without winning. And we have a certain reality as a business that we have an electric bill and we have a payroll and we have insurance payments and we have these sorts of things. So even if you look at it and say, well, over the course of a year, statistically, you're fine, and it probably is true, we would have likely big gaps, right? So the pool provides some smoothing of the curve and that distribution. Now, what happens is, and this gets a little bit technical, I'm going to do my best to make it simple. In Bitcoin, let's say I'm going to send you one Bitcoin, Bob. What happens is, when I send you the Bitcoin, my node communicates to the rest of the world and that this transaction has taken place. And there are tens of thousands of other nodes around the world that, as that message is broadcast about that transition, it propagates to them. And it goes into what's called the mempool. Every node has its own mempool, but for the most part, they're synchronized. So in that mempool sit, like right now, about 250,000 transactions. And you could think of those as checks waiting to clear or credit card transactions waiting to get approved. So they're real, but they haven't been confirmed by being put into a block. And they're not considered real until they're in a block. Okay. So the mining process works by every time a block gets mined, you could think of it as, okay, now it's a free-for-all. And the pools in today's environment each create what's called a template. And so The template has a finite size to it, though. It's basically 4 megabytes, and it will, on average, fit about 4,000 transactions. So they have to have some criteria by which they look in the 250,000 transactions and pick the 4,000. Now, on the surface, you would probably say, well, why don't they pick the ones that will pay the most? Because the way Bitcoin works is when I send that transaction to you, I also include a fee, which you could think of as a tip or a bribe or something like that to the miners to say, pick me. And the more urgency that's tied to the transaction I'm trying to send, the higher the fee is, right? But as we can maybe get in later, it doesn't have to be that way. It is the prerogative of the template creator, which in today's world is the pool, to pick whatever they want. So if we only have like 6 pools that have 90% of the hash rate of the network, the computing power of the network tied to it, that for all intents and purposes means that just those 6 organizations are making those choices. And again, they can use whatever criteria they want. So if we go one to the censorship side, now if an authority comes in and says, hey, to the 2 US pools and the 4 Chinese pools, we're not sending anything to these addresses because we think they're associated with some bad person or somebody we want to direct harm to. They would inflict harm on that organization by doing that. Obviously, Russia and China are pretty friendly right now, but let's say they weren't. Let's say, in today's world, we could lock Russia almost out of the Bitcoin system to a certain degree, just like we've locked them out of the traditional monetary network.
Swift banking system and
the Swift banking system and FedWire and all that like there. So that's one effect. And the other thing, it's a little more technical, but the Bitcoin protocol, it can evolve over time. Now, things like the 21 million hard limit and all that are not going to change, and that's called a hard fork. But small things like bug updates or very small feature enhancements, they're actually activated by the miners signaling their approval for them. So what happens is when you only have, again, 6 places voting, you don't have that kind of democratic view of how the protocol itself should evolve. So those are the 2 really big threats.
So can we just pull on the thread a little bit more about the censorship or somebody being identified as a persona non grata? So you mentioned your own operation. We just could work with that for a minute. What I'm trying to understand is it purely a risk spreading thing, or are there economies of scale? So do you make more? So I understand why the volatility or the standard deviation of your firm's returns are lower if you join the pool, but does it increase your expected return, or is it just linear, and therefore if you or going another way, suppose you started disagreeing, like the pool that you're in, you're in a pool right now, right? That's what correct. I'm gathering. Okay, so suppose that down the road something happens where we don't even need to make it political. Let's just say it has something to do with the Bitcoin protocol, and they want to go along with some change that you don't think is a good idea.
Yeah.
If you pull out and you suppose, could you just find 3 other firms that are kind of like your size, and if you all formed your own little pool, would you be fine? Or is it like, no, we really lose a lot if we're not part of some humongous pool?
So if we look at the mathematical part, the statistical part, the expected value doesn't change at all.
Okay. Yeah.
But the volatility changes a lot, right? So in other words, if you look at 365 days, if you have a given amount of computing power, I could sit down and pretty quickly tell you what the earnings will be for that hash power over a window of that long. The problem is I can't tell you in 30 days. There's going to be a wide distribution probabilities over that, and that's the problem. So, and as you're stating this, it's a very important topic. It's partly why I spoke about it in Nashville, is that in the future, I believe things change dramatically. And this is a bit of a rabbit hole here, so bear with me. But if we look at this and we say, hey, there's 53,000 blocks a year. I gave you that number earlier, right? There's really nothing that we can change that. The protocol is set programmatically to have a mean of 10 minutes.
Right.
By the way, as a math statistics guy, you might appreciate that. The median is quite different. The median is about 6 minutes and 40 seconds. So you have a pretty big difference between the mean and the median in the Bitcoin world. But regardless, in a given year, there's 53,000 blocks. The block size is also a key protocol. There was actually in the mid 2017, 2018, there was something called the block size wars.
Yeah, I vaguely remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's where Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin kind of parted ways, and and obviously there was a clear winner because Bitcoin BTC is 99 times more valuable than Bitcoin Cash. So anyway, that's fixed. So if you do that math, what you'll see is that Bitcoin's base layer has about 200 million transactions as its maximum capacity annually. And there's not a lot that we can do to change that. Okay. Interestingly, almost exactly the same capacity as Fedwire. So if you look up Fedwire and what the annual transactions is, 200 million. It goes like between 191 and 210. So I think that's purely coincidental, but it's a neat coincidence that if you think of Fedwire as kind of the ultimate settlement layer in the global monetary system, Bitcoin is set up really well to handle that same volume. But there's nothing we can do to change that number, right? So today, it's been 18 months since the mempool cleared. If you remember that, what I told you before, that's the repository of pending. So it's typically been well over 100,000. So what it means is that at Bitcoin's current level of adoption, which is very small, right? Probably less than 1% of world's people and way under 1% of the world's companies. There's about 330 million companies in the world, 8 billion people. So the base layer is already spoken for. It's just a lot of the stuff happening there is very small. It's not all financial transactions. A lot of it is I'm moving money from Coinbase into a cold storage, for instance. There's a lot of that sort of stuff. But as time goes by, that access to that space becomes more and more precious. And depending on what you believe about Bitcoin, I'm a really strong believer in it. And I don't necessarily in my lifetime seeing it taking over the fiat system, but I see it as, at a minimum, a very strong alternative economy running. That, it may have, it seems like what the BRICS people are trying to accomplish, in my opinion, already exists. There it is. It's sitting there in Bitcoin as an example. So if I'm correct about that, even to some degree of magnitude, what that means is we're going to see nation states want to be miners. And they're going to want to run pools, or they're going to at least have, this will get a little more technical, there's a subtle way for somebody in the very near future where they'll be able to create their own template and still be part of a pool. So what I see is that ultimately each individual country is going to need to have control of hash rate and template creation as either their primary or backup monetary network. And if they don't, they're locked. They can essentially be locked out. because 10 years from now, it would be my prediction that the demand for block space is going to be so great that it actually won't be that accessible to the average person. It'll only be accessible to large corporations and nation states, and that individual activity will, for the most part, occur at a higher layer like Lightning.
Okay, yeah. So definitely, let's maybe jot a note. I do want to come back to the Lightning distinction and just to have you elaborate on that a bit more. But again, just to keep hitting so you confirm something for me, because this happened, when I wrote that guide, and it's Understanding Bitcoin, folks. You want to go, it's a free guide, and of course I'll link to it in the show notes page here. But I still think it holds up fairly well. Just if like you don't know anything about it, Bitcoin, you always wondered, that's the place to start.
Yeah, it's great. It's a great starting point. I read it several years ago, but you did a really good job.
Well, thank you. And it was funny, Bob, in that, so we were arguing with the pool, and I was saying joining a pool doesn't increase your expected rate of return. So there's no intrinsic, it's not that we would expect over time, like every single, for there just to be one pool that engulfs planet Earth, because at some point by adding more people in the margin, you're not really reducing the standard deviation all that much. And, so that kind of thing. And I went and I gave a talk it was a Texas Bitcoin conference. And I was done, and like in the Q&A, like some guy said, "Yeah, what you just said about the that's just totally wrong. That's not how it works." And he said it with such confidence. The crowd's looking at me, and I was still, I'm like this economist outsider. I wasn't like, and I kind of, and then later when I was so mad, like, no, the guy, he was bluffing. He didn't know what he's talking about. So anyway, I was mad, but okay. So, but again, even there, like, so I do want to, follow up with what you're saying about the like nation states coming on the scene and joining too. But again, in principle, if things got pretty heavy-handed, the groups, peeling off of the large mining pools and forming their own thing like that. Again, as long as what you were joining had a decent set, like if 10% of a humongous mining pool broke off, the expected returns from those members, again, doesn't change at all. It's just
correct.
Their returns would be a little bit more volatile, which, it would be like saying, like, if you didn't like what your company was doing and you were allowed to go leave with some group that went off and formed their own company and your annual salary was totally the same. It's just, you might have to wait 2 months to get your paycheck that would be backed up for 2 months. Would you do it? And most people wouldn't want to do that, but like if their boss was doing really crazy stuff in the first place, then eventually, there'd be some people that would take that deal.
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time on this, and I've much like you, I'm a math science or math stats sort of background, and so what I've calculated is that as long as the group you're affiliated with or the pool you're affiliated with is about 0.5% of the world's hash rate, you're fine. And you could probably go down to 1/4 of the world's hash rate. Mm-hmm. Below that, it gets a little wonky. Because one way to look at it too is if there's 150 blocks per day, roughly. Okay. So you got 150 chances a day. So if you have 0.5%, you're going to get a block roughly every 3 days, something on that order. 1/4 of a Bitcoin, you're going to be in the range of about a week. That'll be in your typical range. And that's usually good enough. Like, that takes enough of the uncertainty out that you're probably fine.
Well, that was my intuition all along, like the kind of numbers you just walked through. But then that leads me to asking, don't worry, we can move on in case the audience is like, we get this. Move on, Murphy, with yours. I'm still fighting that battle from that guy at the Texas Bitcoin conference years ago.
Scarred you, didn't you?
Yeah. I've almost forgiven him, but not myself for backing down. That's really why I was mad, is because I kind of just,
yourself.
He was so confident that I kind of, but no, I should have said, no, you're out of order. So if that's the case, doesn't that kind of raise the question? So then why is there such concentration? Like you're basically saying, so long as you would expect there to be 100 pools globally that were all roughly the same. Yeah. So how come instead of that, we've got 6?
Well, that's a great question. Okay. So what has happened is the mining community, it has highly commercialized. And
it's become a big business. It's gone from, as you said, the guy, whose wife was yelling at him because the house is, a sauna because he's running a mining machine in the living room, right? To now something that's very corporate oriented. And a lot of that is public companies. Okay. So, and there are about 15 now public Bitcoin mining companies. They have, some of them are very high market caps, several $1 billion market caps. And these companies just don't want the responsibility. I'll put it in simple terms. They don't want to worry about it. They just want to get paid. They want to operate data centers and get paid for contributing the hash rate. So another way to look at this is the people running pools are running businesses too, right? And they charge a small fee for running that service. And there is technical competency required. There's a lot of network communication. There are things called block withholding attacks and, things that are kind of like a DDoS attack kind of thing that can happen. So you got to know what you're doing. And I think we've gotten to the point where a lot of these companies don't want to worry about that technical piece and getting that wrong, number one. And number two, I believe a lot of them are afraid of the SEC and OFAC and things like that. And they'd rather just say, hey, I'm not the one making any transaction selections.
Right.
So you can't sue me. I don't have legal exposure because the equivalent of Pablo Escobar got sent some money in a block that I processed. I would rather have plausible deniability and be an arm's length away from this whole thing. So, which by the way is about as un-Bitcoin of a thing as you can do, which is
right.
Because
okay. I see what you're saying. Okay, so it's a combination. It's like you're saying, it's not. It's pretty easy in the abstract to say, "Oh, you form a mining pool," but in reality, that's a business too. And if people didn't know what they were like, not all mining pools are created equal. And so, just like how come there's only a few companies right now, with search engines that people use, then that's kind of standard where like there's a first mover and then they got the thing and then there's usually like a number two nipping at their heels. There's lots of industries like that. And you're saying Bitcoin mining or pooling is one such industry right now where there's just a few big players. But in principle, if things got egregious enough, it could splinter to reassure people who are worried about like civil liberties and whatnot. Okay. Correct. Hey folks, let's take a break from the action to talk about another sponsor you're going to be hearing about over the next couple of months, namely the ExPat Money Summit. So the specific event is going to occur entirely online October 7th through 11th. It's put on by Mikkel Thorup, who's host of the ExPat Money Show. And he is a highly sought after expat consultant with over 2 decades of experience in this space. At this summit, you're going to learn why international diversification is a must for those of you looking to preserve your liberty and wealth. You're going to learn everything you need to know about crafting your perfect plan B, including how to quickly acquire a second passport, diversify your finances offshore, invest in international real estate, and also get in-depth insights on geopolitics from world-renowned experts. Some of the headlining speakers are going to include Ron Paul, Doug Casey, Scott Horton, Tom Woods, Mark Faber, Tom Luongo, and so forth. Also, I'm going to be participating on one of the VIP panels on dollarization or de-dollarization. So to get your complimentary ticket, just go right now to expatmoneysummit.com. That's EXPAT moneysummit.com to get your free ticket for this exciting event that's going to be occurring entirely online October 7th through 11th. Okay, let's get back to the show. Okay, thank you. So that I feel like I have a good handle on that. So now to circle back, maybe just briefly, to talk about the concentration and why you think it's going to shift not just from the guy in his living room to big companies, but to nation states. For people to understand it, maybe just to do a brief digression on what Lightning is, like the difference between the base layer and so forth. And then, okay, so how can it be someone 50 years from now might buy a cup of coffee by moving some Satoshis around? If you're saying, the blocks are going to be so expensive, can you just explain that distinction for people who aren't familiar with it?
Sure. Okay, in any blockchain, there's something called the blockchain trilemma. And the blockchain trilemma is this, that you must design around three attributes: decentralization, security, and speed. And the blockchain trilemma says that it is impossible to design one optimized for all three. That as soon as you optimize for two of them, you have to give up the third one.
Mm-hmm.
One way to look at Bitcoin, I think a lot of people look at Bitcoin and they think of the number go up and this, they'll call it a speculative asset, but it's a gorgeous protocol, a gorgeous piece of technology, and as a guy coming from the early days of the personal computer and looking at the internet, it is as beautiful as anything that's come out in my lifetime. It is jaw-droppingly, I believe, divinely inspired, but that's probably a different topic for a different day. So, Bitcoin is really the first time a network or a protocol has been designed with security and decentralization at the root, and basically giving up speed.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at almost all the other blockchains, although some have claimed they've solved the blockchain trilemma, I think that's hogwash. Almost all of them go for speed and security, and they give up decentralization.
Mm-hmm.
Fundamentally, you bore in, that's what you're going to find. Okay. So what that means is, as I mentioned before, Bitcoin has this capacity of about 200 million transactions annually at what's called the base layer. So that breaks down pretty quickly, obviously, if people start buying coffee with their Bitcoin. But Bitcoin is built on layers. So something called the Lightning layer, which we would call as operating at level 2, was created. So the idea is you're going to take some Bitcoin. You could think of it as going to your bank and withdrawing $100 in cash, right? And you're going to move it off of the base layer into a wallet. That $100 or the equivalent of $100, you move it into a wallet that the Lightning layer sits on. Now, I'm going to oversimplify for the purposes of illustration.
Mm-hmm.
You think of the Lightning layer as another blockchain sitting on top of Bitcoin, optimized for security and speed.
Right.
And so it's that $100 is not in a decentralized world, really. It's highly secure. By the way, it's probably more private even than Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very fast. And it has very low fees associated with it. So the idea will be, this is a network that has a capacity that can rival Visa, MasterCard, American Express. And so, you can move that $100 if, back and forth between layer 1 and layer 2, depending on if you want the equivalent of cash or if you want it, sitting in a highly secure, decentralized place.
Okay. And maybe a different analogy would be, because I've heard some people use versions of this, like let's say the money is gold in the community. And so the base layer might be like big chunks of gold bars sitting in vaults somewhere. And if you have that, like, that's very safe. But that's not convenient to go buy something because it's expensive. Like, you have to send the armored car to get it. And if you want to move the gold from, Zurich to Paris or something, that's really expensive. You would only do it for huge transactions. But then you could take one bar of gold and go, give it to some company that most people trust. And then that company issues claims on that one bar of gold. And then when you're buying your cup of coffee, you're basically just giving over a claim that company issued. So you're not, you're not giving someone the physical gold. You're giving them the claim that they could redeem for the gold, if the physical thing, if they wanted to.
Yeah, it's the gold certificate of the Bitcoin world, correct?
Okay. All right. So that I like, and then that gives you the options to the end user that if you really want to just, no, this is mine, I have my private key, nobody can touch it.
Yeah.
Then you got to move your stuff in. Okay.
Right.
And even
and I
think it's not so much as you're taking it out of the base. Like, it's still there. It's just that the ownership transfers to the Lightning network. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. And then, well, it's probably too technical, but I think the way to think about it is we're in a I believe we're in a transition period where people did buy coffee even today in periods of low fees on Bitcoin. They will buy coffee. They will go buy a couple of tacos. But those days are basically dead. So like in the future, even let's say, you and me, Bob, if I was going to buy your car in Bitcoin 10 years from now, I'm pretty sure we'll still do that as a base layer transaction. Because let's say I'm sending you one Bitcoin worth 80 grand at the time. It's fine. And it's probably a non-urgent transaction, right? That if it happens now or it happens 18 hours from now or 2 days from now, most likely you and I don't care. But if I take you to lunch and we're at Denny's, having a Grand Slam breakfast or something like that, we'll use Lightning for that in the future.
Both because it's a smaller amount and because Denny's can't be waiting 18 hours for it to clear. Before you leave, they got to know that they got their payment.
Right. Yeah. Now, a bit of another, layer deeper on this is now if you think about that and say, well, because we talked some about statistics. Let's say that I'm part of a group and we have 1% of the world's hash rate, just as an example. Okay. That means I'm typically going to mine 1.5 blocks a day. And what I view my business going forward, and I view the whole mining community as being a commodity producer. And the commodity we produce is block space. And I can, much like a farmer planting wheat in the spring, I can have a pretty good idea of what I'm going to produce in future periods too. So what I believe is going to happen is that those people in the business of producing block space, that's our commodity, we are going to start forward selling that space.
Okay.
So I'm actually working on a different project right now, which it's a forward contract derivative. But the idea is I'm sitting here middle of August. Well, I'm pretty confident that the last week of December, block space is going to be really precious, especially as people become more Bitcoin based, right? That there are going to be, for accounting reasons and tax reasons and things like that block space is going to be really valuable. So knowing that I statistically...
Just to make sure people... The accounting is that you mean because as the calendar year winds up, some people might need some transactions to go through before the end of the year? Okay.
Yeah, so if I'm a bicycle producer and I've got a bloated inventory of bicycles and it's December 24th, well, if I get a buyer who wants to pay me 100 Bitcoin to buy me out, I'm going to be pretty motivated to find a way for that transaction to occur. And so I think there'll be a lot of... That's one example of an activity, right? Other people may decide, hey, there could be tax loss harvesting. There could be, all kinds of different things that there's a certain time pressure from the real world that lives on a calendar clock, not on a block clock.
Right.
And so, but using that example, if I produce 1.5 a day, that means I'm going to do about 10.5 per week. So what I could do here in August is I could go to the market and I could say, hey, I'm going to pre-sell access to space in the last week of December at a certain rate. Maybe it's like a hotel. It's just like a hotel room, right? So I'll keep some of my access, some of the block space available for the open market at the end, but I'll have another piece where I'm going to lock in a high revenue rate that I'm comfortable with, lock in my profitability. And I think on the other side are going to be several companies that want to do the same thing. Like as an example, I've put a lot of thought into this. If you look at it in the future and you say, well, say there's a Bank of America equivalent organization. Well, my guess would be you'll see them either become miners or go buy forward contracts from miners way ahead of time. And part of the service they will bring to their bigger customers is, hey, we will guarantee you access to block space at a certain price in certain windows. So you're not locked out. American Express Black Card might come with, hey, you get five free transactions per year. That if I'm going to buy your car, like you said, like, oh, okay, great, I'll use one of my 5 to get this thing done with Bob, and American Express will take care of it. I know this sounds a little funny to people because we live in a world where, like, when wire transfers take place today, generally the bank is charging people a fee. Often that fee is based on the amount of money being moved, or at least in part being moved. And the theoretical capacity of it is, there really isn't a theoretical capacity in any window of time. But in Bitcoin, it flips, right? So Bitcoin doesn't care how much money is moving. It never cares. It just cares about when and how much space you're using.
Right. Gotcha. Just on that, to be clear, with your forward contract idea. So right now that doesn't exist. You're developing it.
Yeah, we've been working on it for 15 months, so it will come out later this year. Yeah.
Okay. But there, you're not hedging away the price risk from Bitcoin per se, right? You're hedging
Not
away
Bitcoin, the price of block space.
That's what I'm getting at. Yeah. So it's like the tip you would have to include to induce someone to process your transaction.
Correct.
That's what you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
It's like, I think hotel rooms is a good analogy, because if you say, well, I don't know, spring break weekend in Fort Lauderdale, you probably want to, if you want to go there, you probably better lock that hotel room in 8 months ahead of time, 10 months ahead of time. Because if you try to book it the week of your trip, you're going to pay through the nose, right? If you can even find one. And Bitcoin is very much analogous to that. Like, there's only a certain number of hotel rooms, and the last few available at the last minute are going to be ungodly expensive.
Right, yeah, but what I was trying to make sure the listener didn't get confused about is you're not saying that, in case someone's worried that the price of Bitcoin, someone who wants to buy some Bitcoin in December, buy it right now with today's price. Like that's not
Correct.
that's not what they're locking in. Okay. Yep. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense too. And I just like, for people who had never thought this through, like as an economist, I talk about in some of my writings that like, what's the social function of derivatives and things. And that, yeah, like operations that bring crude oil to market. And then there's, airlines that of course use a lot of jet fuel. And so that's part of, if the spot price of oil is bouncing around, that's not good for either of them. And they wish they could lock it in and just have more predictability. And so it's just here, like you say, again, not folks talking about the moving price of Bitcoin, but the price of the scarcity of the transaction processing speed and, the fees you're going to have to append to get your transaction to the top of the queue. That's kind of what you're hedging away here. Okay. So that's really interesting. If you don't mind, but one thing though that I think I'm right about, but I just want to get your feedback on, part of the difficulty in what you're trying to do is if I'm a farmer planting wheat and I want to sell either forward or futures contracts on the bushels of wheat, I have some expectations, as you say, about how much I think my harvest is going to be. And no matter what, I could be wrong. There could be locusts could come or whatever. But it's pretty much, the physical processes, as long as something crazy doesn't happen, I have a pretty good idea. Whereas with Bitcoin, am I right in saying it's qualitatively more difficult, because even if your internal operations are fine and it's not like you had a fire at your warehouse or something, if just some big players enter the industry in November with a lot of computing power, then what, your 1% of the market, could have dropped to, 0.5%. And so all your expectations about how many blocks your organization or your pool will be able to mine could be thrown off just because new people entered the market. Is that right?
Only theoretically, practically, no. We're at a point now where the network is so enormous that the law of large numbers make that like almost impossible. So for somebody could come in and say, well, maybe add 5% to the network unexpectedly, but even that would be like ungodly, right?
Okay.
So,
Okay. So you're saying in practice, it's not a big worry, but I'm just trying to isolate so people can see how, partly to appreciate how Bitcoin's kind of an odd thing where if you have a gold mine and you think, oh yeah, in December, we think we're going to have this many ounces of gold that we bring to the certain, so we can sell it now with futures contracts. And as long as we don't have a strike or somebody does, there's not a hurricane or something, we should be able to do that. But if somebody else opened more gold mines around the world, that wouldn't reduce the number of the amount of metal that you could bring to the surface from your mine. Whereas strictly speaking with Bitcoin, technically, if there was a big enough addition to the network, that would actually reduce the flow of Bitcoins accruing to your operation.
Right. But as I said, practically, you'd have to come up with gigawatts at this point to be able to do it. You'd have to come up with gigawatts of energy out of left field.
Yeah.
You'd have to come up with the hardware, the servers out of left field. And those are basically all spoken for way in advance. And then you'd have to operationalize it that quickly. So again, they're just things that just practically can't happen because it's just so big now.
Okay. Yeah. I'm saying when the Martians show up and they say, get a load of our computer.
With their quantum computer. And
everybody on Earth is really happy except you and your buddies. And you're like, oh no.
Yeah. Actually, I give this talk. One of my talks I give sometimes is on if we achieve, like, when does Bitcoin end? I guess a whole nother rabbit hole. Like, when does Bitcoin end? And, my view is Bitcoin ends when we become a Kardashev type 1 society, which for those who aren't familiar with it, basically means we now have the ability to harvest all the energy of the Earth, and the basically the solar system actually, and essentially energy becomes free at that point. And my thesis would be that at that point we'll need some other form of money. So in my estimation, we have 800 to 1,000 years till we get there, and that would be a good run for Bitcoin. So
yeah.
So
can I keep you another 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Tops. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I know we're butting up against the official time. So if we could just circle back to the main, one of the main things I did want you to talk about is just your vision of these different nation states coming onto the scene. So I think people have a sense now, given what we've been talking about, that over time, as more people adopt Bitcoin, it's going to get more expensive to, you'll see presumably the dollar price of Bitcoins will continue to go up. And so the transaction fees associated with a given transaction as a percentage of the value might not be anything, but still it's in absolute terms, it's going to be a lot of money just to, move 100 Satoshis from one person to another or one account to another. And so you're saying you think these nation states. So can you just elaborate on that? Like, how do you see that unfolding? And, I know, people are talking about El Salvador and whatever. Do you think every country needs to get in on that now, or what's the window?
Well, first, I think that transactions will become more expensive, both in fiat terms and Bitcoin terms going forward. So, like, if we just stay in $2024, the network, it'll cost, the network will produce about $12 billion in revenue this year. So that's all the rewards, all the payments to miners is $12 billion. I believe in $2024 that 10 years from now, it'll be closer to $200 billion, dollars generated by the industry. In $24, just to be clear. So meaning, maybe up to 20x growth. Now, the nation state question. So I think what we have to look at is, I believe, we'll get a little political, I guess. I believe Biden made a horrendous mistake with
Just
what
one?
he did. Oh yeah, well, okay, yeah, amazing. Just one mistake. When the Ukraine was invaded by Russia, and he kicked basically Russia off of the global financial system and seized the assets. And I think what he did was he sent a message to the entire world that you're not safe.
Mm-hmm.
So if I was a leader of any, I'm the president of a nation, or I'm the head of the central bank, or whatever. What I'm doing is saying, hey, we got a real problem here. Even if we're on good terms with the U.S. today,
Right.
We've got big problems. Now we've seen the BRICS coming about, right? But I'm not a big fan of BRICS. I think it will fail because I think it ends up looking much like the current system, which is it'll have a group led by men, which and leaders of sovereign countries that all have alternative agendas, and even if they figure out all the technical implementation stuff, that will eventually become a problem. But Bitcoin solves that problem. So what I would do if I were in that position is I would immediately start building Bitcoin mining operations. And not just because I think owning Bitcoin is a good hedge, but more importantly, that it now gives me complete sovereignty to transact in the world with whomever I want. Now, Putin, just in the last few weeks, announced that he has fully embraced Bitcoin mining. They are reaching out aggressively within the world. They've actually been doing this for several months. When I was in Prague, sounds a little spookish, right? But I had several people from Russia approach me. I spoke 3 different times in Prague. I come off the stage, there's a Russian dude waiting to talk to me saying, what can we do to get you to come mine in Russia? Like they're very aggressive about it. And what I would do is if I was a leader of a nation like that, is I would say, hey, I'm going out to all these miners. I'm going to give them phenomenal deals, subsidies, tax breaks, loans, whatever, to come set up operations in my country. The caveat would be they would have to use the national pool. So it would be the Russia pool, the Ethiopia pool, the Bolivia pool, whatever. Because if these countries, we talked about some of the numbers before, they don't have to have a massive amount, 1/10%, 1/4% of the world's hash rate, even in a relatively small, underdeveloped country, gives them that sovereignty now. They always have that. And so I believe some countries will get it and some countries won't. I think right now, out of necessity, Russia gets it and they're going aggressively for it. At the same time, you see things like in Norway right now. Norway is actively pushing for a ban on Bitcoin mining. And by the way, in general, the Europeans don't get it. For some reason.
Is it because they don't like the electricity consumption?
Yeah, they have
global warming reasons.
Yeah, they've convinced themselves improperly. That's a whole nother rabbit hole that Bitcoin boils the oceans, and it does not. It's the greenest industry in the world by far, by a massive measure, and it promotes the development of green energies. It always seeks the lowest cost of production. It sucks up surplus energy that would otherwise be wasted. It is a godsend to people building grids or trying to monetize stranded energy resources. And that's
I was talking with a previous guest. Is that partly because whether you mine at 8 p.m. or at 6:30 in the morning isn't that big a deal, and so depending on what everybody else is using it for, you can just change when you're doing your electricity consumption, so that's easier for the grid?
Well, that's part of it. I was in here. I mentioned I spoke in Prague, and I went to see a large power producer in one of the other countries, and I was talking to them. They have this massive problem. This particular country had converted almost all to solar and wind. Their typical consumption as a country was 45 gigawatts So it's a kind of pretty flat line, right? Occasional peaks to 90 gigawatts. Their typical power production, though, is 100 gigawatts, with their peaks when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing and all that is 190 gigawatts. So usually when the 190 gigawatts happens, they only need 45.
Yeah. So
they're dying for somebody to come in and buy that energy, even for almost nothing. They would, so Bitcoin is a perfect match for that. And when they've invested this massive amount of capital into that infrastructure, and now it's operating at its maximum level, and they can't even sell it. It's like the economics are all messed up. No, we won't go Austrian on everybody here, Bob. But I mean, they're messed up because this got subsidized to the hilt, and it shouldn't have. Right. There was a massive misallocation of capital to this thing. Whether you're a climate denier or a climate, I don't know what, advocate, whatever. It was a messed up system, right? In terms of economic incentive.
Right. Okay, so your big picture, they're doing. I guess partly maybe what might be throwing some people who aren't as familiar with it is you were making the distinction. It's not just that. Oh yeah, you think it would probably make sense for central banks around the world, just like I know Russia and China are really bulking up their gold stockpiles. That they might want to add Bitcoin as part of their strategic reserve. And I know that was, something that was talked a lot about at the national conference. But you're saying even besides that element of it, and just in terms of like an inflation hedge or whatever, just to have the movement of a medium of exchange or to be able to do that. So it's my like the term mining might almost be a misnomer to some people that makes it sound like, oh, what mining does is it brings new Bitcoins into existence, but it also, that's the process by which you move an already mined Bitcoin from one wallet to another.
Yeah, because now Russia and Iran can do a deal, and nobody can stop that transaction. In fact, technically, nobody even may know that it occurs. So, I mean, and we probably view the world more from them being evil and us being, and again, there's so many rabbit holes, but I personally believe money should never be used as a weapon or means of control, and that it's morally wrong to ever do that. But this provides that protection, that insurance against that. And so even if it doesn't make sense economically in any one moment in time, it makes a hell of a lot of sense as a safeguard against a directed action kicking somebody out of the financial system.
Yeah, and I agree with you too. I think a lot of world leaders seeing like what has unfolded with the U.S. vis-a-vis Russia, like you say, even countries that are on decent terms with Washington, they might say, yeah, right now for the next 5-10 years, everything's probably fine, but we can't say what's going to happen 20 years from now, and let's not find ourselves in a position where someone can just flip a switch and all of a sudden, we don't have access to global financial markets.
Yeah. And you asked me a question I didn't really properly answer, which is now. Like, do it now, and then keep up. So if you even if you do it at this really low threshold, like a 0.1% or 0.25% of the world's hash rate, do that now and then keep up and maintain that rate,
right? Roughly
over time. Because if you wait 20 years and then you're on the wrong end of the equation at that point, where are you gonna find the equipment, find the power, operational? I mean, it's too late. You're screwed.
Yeah, because also the same coalition of powerful nations that's trying to shut you out could be, embargoing those elements going into your country if you don't have
especially the machine. Especially the machines, right?
Okay, can I maybe ask one final thing to wrap this all together is, can you just talk about, people colloquially throw on this phrase 51% attack. Is that a misnomer, and how does that relate to, because I could imagine some people saying, okay, so yeah, suppose some small country has 1% of the global hash rate, but if the US and UK together have 51%, can't they just run the show? And can you just talk about that?
All right. So there's a theory and a practice, right?
Sure.
So theoretically, it's possible. And, in a world where there's a bunch of pools aggregated, a few of those pools assembling, like the 4 Chinese pools, they're in the range of 50% right now. They get together and they want to create a directed attack on Bitcoin. Here's the problem. And I can't remember if you addressed this in your paper or not, but Bitcoin works by tens of thousands of people today maintaining a ledger. Okay, and that ledger is the entire history of the Bitcoin blockchain. Now, let's say a block got mined that was nefarious, that was part of what we would call 51% attack. Somebody was trying to give themselves money that didn't exist. That would be basically what it typically says. Now, if that happened, then the nodes of the world, first of all, can just say, I'm going to reject that. And that chain that includes this block, I'm not going to accept it. And if they continue to try to present it to the world, I'm going to block my node, my version of the ledger, from ever receiving anything else from the nodes that are broadcasting that. So that's one level of defense. Now, if that happened, what you would have is, we'd call it a hard fork. And there would probably be 2 chains in the world, one maintained by this group, one maintained by another group. And it would be up to the world to decide which one it wished to accept. So you would expect that there would be a large group of people that would reject this one that gave money to somebody they didn't deserve. Mm-hmm. But you would still have the original chain. That's number one. Number two, the 2 chains, the rest of the mining network is clearly not going to accept that block either. So what they would do is with 49%, let's say, they would go try to mine a different block. So if that happened to be block number 900,000, that was nefarious, well, then the rest of the network would then race 49% racing against 51%. The 49% would try to mine block 900,000 and 900,001. And if it did, it would now be the longer chain. So the guys broadcasting the nefarious block, if they got beat by the 49%, then they don't even have the longest chain and they lose there too. So there's 2 answers to the question that make it not something I lose any sleep about. The first one is the network always has the option of just simply rejecting it, which is, I think, what would happen. But it also has the chance of outcompeting it. And I just don't see any scenario in which anybody would be motivated to do that, because they probably have a lot more to lose than they would have to gain.
Okay. All right. That's, I guess, just to put the last dot on that. So am I thinking about it right? Is it correct, at least, big picture, to say, suppose, 15 years from now, we are in a position where there's the major powers and they all have their respective hash rates as a fraction of, the global total. And that if there really were just serious geopolitical rivalries in play, would there just, at some point, possibly just be a hard fork? And it would be like the BRICS nations are using, the BRICS Bitcoin and everybody else is using classic Bitcoin, or whatever labels they throw on them. Is that theoretically possible?
It's theoretically possible. It's what happened in 2017. We mentioned it briefly. There was something called the block size wars, where Bitcoin Cash went one way. So if you look at the Bitcoin Cash blockchain, it is, I forgot what the number is, but blocks 0 to 600,000 are identical between Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin. And then they started diverging. And they do to this day. But you can have either coin. And in fact, if you had Bitcoin at block 600,000, you actually got both.
Yeah, that happened to me, and I was like, "Whoa, that's interesting."
Yeah, and what happened was
surprise.
Most of the people said, "Okay, cool. Well, I don't really want this Bitcoin Cash thing, so I'm going to sell it." And it's like, and then I'll take that money and I'll buy more of the other Bitcoin with it. And so, a whole bunch of money flowed that way, and now we sit at a point where I think Bitcoin Cash has a market cap of about 6 billion or something on that order, versus Bitcoin at 1.2 billion.
You mean trillion?
Or trillion, excuse me.
Okay.
1.2 trillion versus 6 billion. So, in essence, the exact same thing would happen.
Yeah. Okay.
And so, like I said, I don't worry about it because I just don't see anything bad happening. Like as soon as somebody does that, it's not Bitcoin anymore. It's something else. And the world can decide if that has value or not. I probably wouldn't see it as having any value.
Okay. Well, that's a good place. So thanks. I certainly learned a lot in this. I had a bunch of intuitions, but you really helped me get my head wrapped around them. So folks, my guest has been Bob Burnett, the CEO of Barefoot Mining. Bob, thanks so much for your time and your insights.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. See you next time.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.